So we're going to talk about work team development, and primarily what we're going to be talking about here is when we're talking about work teams. I want to define that a little bit different than some of the other ways we've been talking about teams. So generally speaking, when we're talking about a team, we're usually talking about an integrative process where the team's goals are shared and that work within the team is interdependent on that team. Now, when we talk about interventions for work team development, we're usually focusing more on job redesign or how to design individual jobs to where that job itself, by its very nature, is more motivating. Now, within that, a part of that component is to increase people's integration with other people doing the same job. So a work team usually is going to be defining a part of an intervention where we're redesigning jobs in such a way that individuals who are doing work that is not interdependent but is similar to other people are placed into basically problem solving and support groups. And I think this is going to become more clear as we actually talk about the idea of redesigning the job based on some core dimensions to make it by its very nature more motivating. So this is a different way to motivate employees, make them more satisfied, make them more committed to the organization, but also make them better problem solvers and more productive outside of directly setting goals. So job design itself involves changing jobs to improve the satisfaction and productivity of individual workers. And it basically usually is looking more at the lower level or production line work or work in general. So we've kind of been talking about, for example, management by objectives. One of the limitations of it is it's fairly expensive, and most research has found it works best at basically kind of high skill level, professional level jobs, and is not as good of a fit for kind of semi-skilled to low-skilled labor. So job redesign kind of fills in that gap a little, if you will. So many variables are involved in job design: the worker themselves, the nature of the work, organizational climate, managerial style, and a fair amount of that is actually captured in the systematic process of deciding how to redesign a job. The main thing I want to kind of hit here for a moment is the idea that the worker themselves is a major component of this. So whenever we're trying to motivate people by setting goals, by providing rewards or incentive, or even redesigning the job, we do want to stop for a minute and ask, is this what's going to actually fit the workers and the culture of this organization? So do I need to change the organizational climate and culture first before I implement a job redesign? And is this job redesign going to actually be a good fit with the current workers in this organization? So we're going to look at two closely related theories of job design: job characteristics theory, which is a little bit more of kind of an objective, systematic way to look at jobs, and job enrichment theory that kind of boils down the main two components of characteristics theory into kind of a broader theoretical framework, if you will, about how to design more enriching work. So job characteristics theory is a theory that attempts to develop objective measures of job characteristics, and the purpose is to directly affect employees' attitudes and work behaviors. So broadly speaking, just as we want to measure the personality and abilities of an individual to hire them. So if we're wanting to hire someone, we want to know, do they have the skill sets and the knowledge necessary to do the job? And we'll often try to measure those in some form of selection series of tests, whether it's a personality test, whether it's cognitive ability, whether it's simply just work history, to determine if they have the appropriate skills. When we're looking at an organization, we're often wanting to measure culture or climate. Again, we're trying to kind of define what are the key components that we can actually measure this organization's culture or climate on that relate to how well people work within it. And the idea behind a job analysis is that we actually want to measure the key skills necessary to do the job to help us match people for that job. Job characteristic theory, similarly, is trying to find what are the key components of any job that if we alter or improve will result in that job being more motivating by its very nature. So job characteristics theory basically suggests there's 5 core job dimensions, and I often like to think of these as similar to the big 5 personality factors in people. So we know that basically most people's personality can be broadly defined by openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism or emotional stability. So this theory basically suggests that all jobs have 5 core dimensions: skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and job feedback. And the idea is that the lower you have in any of these, the less engaging the job will be. The higher you have in these, the more engaging or motivating the job will be. So we'll take each one of these and briefly in turn. Skill variety is the type of skills involved. So a very low skill variety job would be that not only is the skill itself not very engaging, you really only are relying on one or two skills to do your job. So think of someone on an assembly line that does the same task over and over and over again. That would be a very low skill variety job. Compared to a very high skill variety job is that every day you might be using different skill sets and different parts of your education and your training and your past experiences. So I'll just use my own job as a college professor, for instance. So I have to use my research skills if I'm working on a paper, my writing skills if I'm writing it up, my statistical skills if I'm trying to analyze a database. I have to use my social skills when I interact with students. I also work on committees, so I need to have skills in group work. We may be doing administrative tasks one day. We may be doing tasks that are focused on trying to improve the program and program design. And of course, I'm also teaching classes, but not just teaching classes. I'm teaching undergraduate, graduate student, in person and online. So there's a lot of skill variety in my job. So the job, 5 core job dimensions of job characteristic theory would suggest that my job by its very nature is going to be more engaging and more motivating. So one of the things we can think about as far as using this theory is that when we measure a job, if we find it has very low skill variety, is there a way we could redesign the job to where there is more skill variety? This has been done in a lot of kind of manufacturing positions where instead of someone always doing the same job, they're allowed, if they want to learn other skills. And if they learn other skills, they can then rotate through the organization. So for instance, if you're making cars for Ford, where your job may have always been you simply put on the brake pads. You could actually apply and say, I want to do other things, and you could actually learn how to do the welding of the body. You could learn how to actually install the carburetor. I'm just coming up with a few things off the top of my head. And then you could be on a rotation where some weeks you're on the brake line, but some weeks you're on the engine line, and some weeks you're on the actual frame line. This is an idea of actually making the job you do have more variety. Task identity somewhat goes hand in hand with this. The more you can identify the piece of work at the end, and the more that you can actually understand how your role created that, the higher the task identity. I'm going to use the university for a quick example here. So the main objective of a university is to create knowledge and to educate students. But there's a lot of staff that are required to actually support that job, including, for example, custodial. This would be an example where task identity may be fairly low if you're a custodial worker at a university. In other words, your job itself may be very hard to identify as an identifiable piece of work. In other words, understanding what you're actually doing and how it fits the larger impact of the organization. Now, another way to kind of look at this is, can we come up with a way to where people actually can at least identify individual parts of what they're doing as actually having an identifiable outcome? Possibly another way to look at this is I used to work construction years ago, and the company I worked for, we actually called it from ground break to final nail. And that wasn't the name of the company, but that was our model, that we basically built residential houses, and we started by doing the surveying on an empty piece of lot, and we basically were on the job from that first time the shovel hit ground to the time the house was ready to move in, which meant that I can actually go back to my hometown and point to houses that I built. Not just me individually, but the team I was on. That's very high task identity. It's an identifiable piece of work. Now, compare that to the next job that I did. I actually worked as a clerk at a retail store. It was kind of hard to really tell what my day-to-day selling of various small trinkets really was identifiable as anything that I could point to and say, this is something I did. So again, task identity, can you actually point to an identifiable piece of work at the end of the day and say, I helped make that? If you can, that's higher task identity. And again, the more we can set that task identity or change a job to where people can see that task identity, the more motivating it's going to be. Task significance is, again, kind of highly tied. These are all somewhat tied together, but they are also separate. With task significance, can we actually tell how the task we're doing directly impacts the life of others? So again, I'm going to go back to the university with that custodial staff member. How do we actually increase task significance there? Well, it can be done through culture, it can be done through memos, it can also be done by having the actual custodial staff involved a little bit more in the final products of the university, maybe inviting them or even having an appreciation dinner at graduation to where they know that their job still is impacting the lives of others. Another good example of task significance was that the way that custodial staff here used to work is all of the actual cleaning they did was after hours. In other words, I never actually met any of the people that were cleaning my office. They actually had a change in this, and this was actually purposely done as a part of the job characteristics theory, to where now they actually work during the day and they come in to check to see if anything needs to be cleaned in your office. And it's a brief interaction, but that interaction now allows them to actually see the people that they're helping to make their jobs easier. And results have shown that this has been helping a lot in actually keeping retention of the staff. Next one's autonomy. The more you have control over what you do, the more you have control over when you work, and the more you have control over the scheduling of your work, generally the more motivating and satisfied you're going to be. So low autonomy, you don't know, you are always clocking at the same time, you always clock out at the same time, and the tasks are being set for you, you have no control. Full autonomy, as long as your work's being done, you can do it in any order that you want. You don't have to come in at any particular time. Basically, it's just are the objectives being met. So that's kind of the spectrum on this. And again, the higher the autonomy, generally, the more we're going to see an increase in job satisfaction, motivation, and commitment. And finally, feedback. The more you get direct feedback about how you're doing, the better. So a very low job feedback means you almost never hear anything positive or negative unless you kind of mess up. High job feedback means that you're constantly getting information of how well you're doing. So broadly speaking, this kind of results in almost a mathematical equation. In fact, it is a mathematical equation, and I don't really want to focus too much on this, other than the fact that when we're actually defining a job by these 5 dimensions, there's actually ways to measure this and put it on a numerical scale, and then to actually determine how potentially motivating that job is. The main thing I want to point out from this equation is that skill variety, task identity, and task significance do factor in, but they kind of factor in almost on top of each other. So we actually add the 3 of them together and divide by 3, which means all 3 of those are fielding into 1/3 of the equation. The other 2/3 are autonomy and job feedback. So the takeaway here is giving people good feedback and autonomy, control over how they do their job, are the 2 big factors. Task significance, identity, and skill variety all have an impact, but a lesser impact. So methods for improving jobs, knowing this, take fractionalized tasks and put them together. So as much as we can actually have someone use multiple skills, so in other words, not having everyone do one thing, but have people do a series of tasks, and they can put them together to see a final product being done, that's going to improve jobs. And again, it's going to be more motivating. We want to form natural work units. In other words, we want to put people together to where at least they have some social interaction and the ability to problem solve. So if you have a custodial staff, actually putting together 7 custodial workers that work in the same area of the university to where they meet once a week to discuss, what's going on, is there anything we could do to be doing our job better, and also giving that work unit a little bit of control over what they do, that again, that's going to add into that autonomy factor and somewhat the feedback factor as well. Allow employees to have direct contact with people using the products or services. So as much as possible, do what you can to where people can see that their work is having an impact in the success of the organization. Allow as much as possible an employee to decide on work methods, budgets, and managing crisis. And again, this is often easier if you form people into natural work groups. So instead of a manager having to deal with each individual person, which might be very time consuming, think back to kind of management by objectives, it now is a group of people that can check in once in a while with their supervisors. And finally, establish feedback channels so employees can learn how they're performing. Job enrichment theory basically just kind of looks at this as a slightly broader picture, and it basically suggests that jobs should be redesigned to improve motivation. Permit employees to obtain more responsibility and achievement. So the idea here is that you want to increase their achievement, their recognition, their responsibility, their advancement, and their challenge. So again, kind of 5 factors, but it's more broadly just speaking, kind of giving people control over the jobs they do and make sure that they're being recognized for the work that they do.